pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Mara, if you would like to make the introductions.
Oh, I'd be happy to. First of all, thank you for coming. This is wonderful to see everybody here. We're going to introduce our consultants. See if I can get this right. Jesse comes to us from UTL, and Tim Love from UTL. Emma Troller from Fort Point Associates, and Dan Bartman from Dan Bartman Associates.
The associate.
Yeah, the associate. We have continuity from the team that put together the revitalization roadmap for Littleton Common in Emma and Jesse. And new to the team are Tim, who's going to be doing a lot of the graphics for the form-based code, and Dan, who is the guru in the area, in the state actually, for form-based code. So it's very exciting to be working with all of them.
Okay, should I take it away?
Please.
My name is Tim Love. I'm a founding principal of UTL. We're a 60-person design and planning firm based in Boston. And we were on the team for the revitalization plan and played a big role in that work if you came to the open house for some of the meetings. What we're going to do tonight is a couple of us are going to speak. We're going to explain how this fits into ongoing planning the town's been doing. Jesse's going to talk about how this is a natural evolution from the work that we did before, but even decisions that have happened relative to the master plan, for example, that are feeding into our perspective on this. Jesse's also going to provide a brief overview of the preferred scenario from that work, but also the critique of it that we got a little bit during the open house as well. Dan's going to explain what a form-based code is relative to your existing land use policy, your zoning code, and where a form-based code might tinker with your existing code. He's going to also explain that our logic when we do this is to change as little of the zoning code as possible so that it's not a revolution, to go in where it makes sense to make adjustments. And then we're going to show some example from other nearby town centers about where there are form-based codes, what the impacts have been, and the way that a form-based code can make the outcome of development a little bit more predictable in terms of look and feel and design. That's really the logic behind doing this. So that's the overview. So I think with that, Jesse's going to kind of talk about where we are in the process.
Great, sure. Thanks, Tim. So this is just a timeline situating the current form-based code work relative to the master plan that was completed in 2017, which led to a number of actionable items, many of which are complete, such as updating the Aquifer and Water Resource District, evaluating the Smart Sewer Plan. In the middle here is the Littleton Common revitalization project that we worked on in 2018 and completed. And one of the items from that, stemming from that, is the form-based code, which we're here for today. It's important to know that form-based code, and what we'll get into, is looking at regulations on the private property in the private realm, and to sort of completely revitalize Littleton Common will require a broader set of items, such as implementing new crosswalks, sidewalks, and etc. Another item from an earlier moment in 2010 will also feed into this, which is the creation of the Village Common District, which sort of set out an aspiration to create a mixed-use, walkable village town center for the Littleton Common, but for a couple of reasons has been slow in that progress, one of which is that it's left many of the fundamental metrics of zoning in place and unchanged, such as parking ratios. So I'll just quickly give a quick refresher on the selected scenario from the revitalization roadmap, and also some of the critiques and where we're making changes going into form-based code. As mentioned, one of the outcomes of the 2017 master plan is an evaluation and ultimately the approval of a smart sewer project. And we see this as a critical basis for what we're imagining for mixed use in the Littleton Common. Many of the things that we would like to see, such as restaurants, cafes, we want to have in this mixed use district, will be very much predicated on just a higher gallon per day usage allowance. The scenario planning work that we did are based on a set of mapping analyses of the Littleton Commons, such as land use here, vacancies, building density, and et cetera, which informed both the study area, but also a number of what we call soft sites, which are highlighted here in blue. And these are sites that we think are deemed more likely for redevelopment. And essentially the scenario planning work was based on these selected soft sites. And they're sites that we can probably take a guess at. They're sites that are either underdeveloped or vacant, have excessive parking, many of the banks with very large sort of front paved areas. And so we zoomed into an area to illustrate the qualitative effects of this different scenarios. Here in this case, we're looking at specifically 8 parcels at kind of the bottleneck moment of the common, because there's a great concentration of these soft sites, and also some of the dimensions of these sites were difficult to work with. So we wanted to illustrate what that would be like. In this case, a number of commercial uses, retail and office, are pushed up against the street to engage the pedestrian. Parking's in the rear. And since then, since the open house and notes from the public survey, we've made critiques to it and changes, such as not allowing anything over 3 stories. If there are 3-story residential against the street, that they will have to have retail that engages the pedestrian and the public realm, and a few other notes. So before I just turn it over to Dan, who will talk about form-based code in general, it's also important to just kind of remind that any kind of recalibration of zoning within form-based code or otherwise would likely take a number of years, probably decades. So this is just a very kind of hypothetical illustration over the course of, for example, 30 years. Ultimately, these are private properties, and the town does not have control over them. So that's just a quick refresher on the scenario that we ended up on, and Dan will talk about form-based code.
Thank you, Jesse. Hello, everyone. I'm Dan. I thought for a minute, because this is my first 20 minutes in Littleton even, I thought I'd start with a slide introducing myself. So I've been doing this work since 2010. Actually, I started while in grad school, working with another private firm where we had a virtual office, and we traveled all around the country actually writing calibrated codes for specific communities all over the place. So I've written ordinances for Massachusetts, Connecticut, Michigan, Utah, California, Mississippi, and Georgia. And if you look to the side here, one of the things I wanted to point out is that all of those codes are very different. And one of the things I want to make sure that you understand is we're not trying to take a code from somewhere else and apply it here in Littleton and make you be something else that you're not. Right? The whole point of doing this work is to implement a plan that you all came up with for your community, and so we want to calibrate and write a customized code specifically for you. The other thing is that I think the best way to describe form-based codes and what they're doing is actually to talk about what is typically in place already, which is often or primarily referred to as use-based zoning. When form-based codes first came into the market, it was probably the late 90s maybe, and they were kind of marketed as like this savior that was going to come in and save your community, all new zoning. But the result of that marketing campaign actually led to people thinking that that coders were trying to force places to be somewhere that they're not. The real thing is that we're using form-based techniques in zoning to improve what you already have, so that you can, so that one day you'll have the result of all of your planning work. So just to start off, the whole use-based zoning concept is that the format and organization of a zoning ordinance is around land use, the activities that happen on property or within a building. And that's what you have here in Littleton, right? So literally your code says the town of Littleton is hereby divided into the following types of zoning districts: residential, business, industrial A, industrial B. That was primarily the starting 4 districts that you had. These colors are Littleton's colors. I sampled them right out of off your zoning map, but these are the typical zoning districts that you find across the country in use-based zoning. Use-based zoning first started in New York in 1916, and it was the same exact thing. 3 land use zones: residential, commercial, and industrial, and that was it. It just sorted different properties across the city into different land use zones. And they called it a day until 1960, when they started trying to solve some other problems that were existing there. But rapidly after New York did that, lots of municipalities, towns and cities across the country adopted zoning in following New York's lead, right? The problem is that New York never mapped entire giant swaths of the city to be just residential or just commercial or just industrial. They have really fine scale. And so they never lost the pedestrian aspect of their city, right? The problem is that, in a lot of places across the country, we zoned acres and acres and acres of land as residential and acres and acres and acres of land as commercial, and it separated everything out, and we lost the walkable type of communities that the country was really built from. And one of the things that you're trying to get back to in Littleton, to create a walkable traditional New England town center, right? So use-based zoning that separates the city and doesn't allow mixed use is one of the problems. So here, again, here's your zoning map. There's some complexity added on top of this basic setup of 4 different land use zones. In 2010, the Village Common District was added, right around the existing town center. And all of those districts reference this use table that sorts different types of residential commercial uses. They only put 1 page of this. I think it's 3, if I remember right. But this is the general setup. So we have 5 districts, and it sorts different uses into those different districts, but primarily based off of their name, right? The residential one place, business in another. On top of that, you have some overlay districts. Here you have the Littleton Overlay District West Beaverbrook Area Overlay District, which is in the hashed, right, on top of some industrial and over top of the Village Common. And on top of those, you also have the Aquifer District and the Water Resource District. I'm not telling you all anything new. You already know that all of these layers exist in your city. So there is some interest in not only the new district that might exist for the Village Common, to already understand what you're trying to accomplish through all of these overlays and just embed it in the zoning for that district instead of having to have 7 overlays on top of one another, right? One of the things that's beneficial for a new zoning ordinance or revisions to the existing zoning ordinance is to make it more understandable to the everyday reader and to any property owner or developer that might be building according to your plan, right? You want them to understand what you're looking for up front, so you don't have to argue about it later. That's the whole problem with permitting, right? If people don't understand what you wanted beforehand, then you end up arguing and fighting about it when they're trying to permit it.
Well, people argue anyway.
Well, people argue anyway. But we want to minimize that as much as possible. So we want to write zoning that's clear and concise. One of the things you'll see later is that form-based codes use a lot of pictures to try and provide as much advanced knowledge beforehand, so that people have an understanding of what you're asking for early in the process. Put that all together, and you have a bunch of, I didn't have a map for the marijuana dispensary overlay, but I wanted to identify that that's there. So you have a bunch of districts that, that are typical of use-based zoning, and some complexity that's added because you have some overlay districts. Now, related to all that, the second most popular item in a use-based zoning district came around in the 1960s. In your code, it's called the intensity of use schedule. And in some other zoning ordinances, it's called the dimensional standards. These are sometimes very simple metrics and sometimes very complex ones. I'm going to show you a couple of them. In your ordinance, you have lot area, which is just the size of a lot. most often in square feet. Some codes actually dictate the width and depth of a lot, dimensions specifically. I believe you just have area. Lot frontage is the lot width that has to be abutting a street. Front, side, and rear setbacks. Does everybody understand what setbacks are? Right, just a distance from the lot line that your building has to be. Building height, of course, is not often number of stories, or it could be the number of feet that a building is in total. And then lot coverage, how much of the percentage of the lot that your building covers. One of the good things for your existing ordinance and into the future is that you do not have the bane of all zoning, floor area ratio. Does anybody have an experience with floor area ratio? So you can see here, floor area ratio was actually invented in the 60s for New York City skyscrapers. That part of the message was never conveyed to all of the towns and cities that adopted floor area ratio for their houses, right? And one of the problems is that floor area ratio is literally designed to be like Play-Doh, right? New York City wanted to allow people to mold, especially the upper half of their skyscrapers, into any shape, so you could have some architectural diversity in the skyline. The problem is we typically don't want to see all kinds of crazy shapes and sizes for houses, right? We want to allow some amount of diversity so that people can express themselves through the design, the different roofs and number of gables of their house, but not that there's weird projections and things sticking out where they don't belong, right? We want some harmony, but individual freedom on your own property. And one of the problems is that with floor area ratio, it really literally is Play-Doh. I didn't bring this slide with me, but you can build a house out of Play-Doh, you can make little bricks, but you can also build a dinosaur. Right, and that level of unpredictability is something that's really bad in zoning, but you have a really good starting point because you never went off course by adopting floor area ratio into your zoning ordinance. Now, a third layer on top of all of the districts that you have and the overlays and the dimensional standards is for the village district was a set of special design provisions. I'm gonna have a hard time reading these from that distance, but
You can read them from the computer.
I highlighted here some of the problems with design standards that are written more like guidelines is words like appropriate, moderate, similar, compatible, right? None of those have a legal meaning. and they end up being debated and argued about later on in the process. But we've actually learned over the decades that form-based codes have been refined over time how to actually codify a lot of those things. So we can figure out how to actually get at what you're talking about when you say you want something to be compatible. This is actually a common thing found in codes because when a lot of these things were written, we didn't have a lot of those tools in place. There's been a skyrocketing of form-based codes adopted across the country since 2010. I have a spreadsheet. I think we're up in the 600s or something like that. And everything from small communities to giant, large cities. So one of the things that I think is something worth pointing out is that the city of Hartford adopted a form-based code for its entire city. But also there's lots of little towns and villages that have a form-based code, and there's lots of places that have a form-based code just for their town center, like what you're talking about. So it's not necessarily a tool for a big urban place versus a small rural place. What I referenced earlier is that the techniques of form-based zoning can help you produce more predictable results. And get away from the problem of these kind of spongy terms that mean well, but in interpreting them later on, people sometimes lose their meaning. So let's look at an example. What wouldn't work towards creating your vision for your town is really related to the existing zoning. So we have an existing site here on King Street that if you look at where the existing zoning, the requirements, so these are the existing buildings, and in blue, you can see a 25-foot setback line, which is just 25 feet from the front lot line. I think do you remember what the side setback is? 10,
15.
So it creates this box internal to the lot, right, where the building is allowed to be. And you also, on top of that, so there's the 15. On top of that is a 50% max impervious surface coverage. This is trying to protect your water resource district, right? And something that we're going to talk about in a little bit is that that's not the only tool available to protect water quality. But at one point in time, it's the only one we knew. We want to allow stormwater to penetrate into the ground, and so we can't fill the lot fully with a whole building. And again, as time has passed, we've learned through trying to develop new regulatory tools that there are other ways to achieve that goal. So add to this the 20 parking spaces that would be required for this building. and make sure that it's inside the setbacks, and this is the kind of setup you would get. Not bad, but not reflective of what you were trying to build based off of your plan. If you change this, so the problem is that the intensity of use schedule, or the dimensional standards, are applied uniformly across all buildings in the district. And one of the things we brought up is that in your use zones that are specifically residential or specifically commercial, this might be okay, because all residential could be treated the same. Everybody building a house has the same dimensional standards, and everybody building a commercial building has the same dimensional standards. When you apply an intensity of use schedule or dimensional standards in a district where you want mixed uses, like in the Village Center District, the problem is that houses or residential apartment buildings and commercial buildings and mixed-use buildings aren't the same, right? That's a lesson we've been learning around the country. So it's really, you have a problem with your intensity of use schedule. So it reminded me that I could come back to this slide. All of the good intention of these 2 pages of design guidelines and standards for your Village Center District are being undermined by the dimensional standards table. Right? These same things that you're looking to achieve here can't be accomplished because legally you have dimensional requirements that are pushing development to not reflect what you're looking for. So that's the first thing that we need to undo. So if you made, some generic recommendations are up here, but we would calibrate these specifically for Littleton. But this is an example of what could happen if we just go in and adjust the dimensional standards. And that's the big difference about a form-based code. Dimensional-based code or dimensional standards-based code, intensity of use-based code sounds terrible, right? So they called it form-based code. All they're doing is improving the dimensional standards and making them the priority and raising them above the separation of use districts, and saying that really it's how we build our buildings and the size that they are, the shape that they are, how well they address the street. Those are the things that we've learned that are more important than just moving the uses apart from one another, especially now that our cities don't have lots of noxious industrial uses like they used to back in the day. So this is an example. This could be the exact metrics that we end up landing on. But we wanted to show you what's possible comparing this slide, I think it's 4 back, to this one, right? So it's a better version of what you're trying to achieve based on your plan. And that's how you calibrate a form-based code. You have to start with planning. You run into the same problems with use-based zoning that doesn't reflect what you're trying to achieve if you write a form-based code without a plan, right? I calibrated this a little bit for this presentation, but the basic elements of a form-based ordinance or a form-based code or a form-based district like you will have is that building form standards, like I said, are prioritized. So normally we end up creating sheets that look like this. These 2 examples are this is an apartment house. This is actually the proposed ordinance in Somerville, Massachusetts, and then a sheet from a project that Tim and I worked on in Detroit. So you can see that these 2 obviously those municipalities are very different from one another, but the same techniques were being utilized in both of those places to produce better results. We draw pictures that end up being, they're not regulatory, they're informative. And these little black buttons that you can see like floating around the graphic, they correlate with the table down here, right? And so you can see the width of the building is then referenced up in the picture. So it helps describe what all of these dimensions actually look like by providing a picture as an example of what we're talking about. So building form standards, that becomes the primary aspect of a form-based code. On top of that is actually figuring out where to put parking. One of the things that you have right now is a parking requirement, right? Like 1 for every 1,500 square feet of a building or something like that, but not many standards about where it goes. Sometimes there's requirements about, there should be trees or a buffer between a parking lot and another use, but there's not a lot of standards in zoning that say where it should go in relation to the public realm and how it affects pedestrians. And form-based codes have also tackled that. They figure out how do we have parking in and around our buildings that doesn't interfere with our goals for a more pedestrian, traditional New England village center. And on top of that, because this is Littleton and we're protecting those water resource areas, one of the other examples is that the stormwater management can actually be written into the district itself. This is an example from Simsbury, Connecticut. They actually wrote form-based standards for stormwater management, so that all of their parking lots understand how to channel and convey water to the right places. All of their buildings talk about how much of the lot needs to be permeable or captured on site. So all of these things are items that were identified in your master plan and your revitalization plan for goals that you wanted to achieve. And I wanted to point out that there are codes happening in and around you that are achieving all of these goals, and it's possible to do here. And we're going to use these as examples of techniques, but we're going to write specific versions of those same things for Littleton here, so that we can achieve those same goals. So I wanted to provide you an example from Higgins Beach. This is an example of a use-based ordinance. Scarborough, Maine is where Higgins Beach is. And they have a use-based code that says residential goes here. And they have the dreaded floor area ratio that's telling them how much interior floor space they're allowed to build. So they have lot area times some number equals the amount of floor space. And although they're allowed to build 2.5-story buildings here, maybe 3, they weren't given enough floor area to fill up the volume inside the setbacks, and so they were ending up with houses like this, right? And so one of my close friends was hired for them to write a form-based code and said, we're getting terrible houses here, and it's one of the beaches that's kind of attracting more development, and we want to make sure that more of this doesn't happen, right? And so they went in and they adjusted the dimensional standards, just like the main problem that you all are experiencing here. And these are the houses they're getting now. And I wanted to show, I know this isn't a town center, but it's one of the best examples I've seen, especially locally within New England, of dimensional standards that are going wrong and then dimensional standards that are going right. And so that's going to be our primary focus, making sure that the new dimensional requirements that we would adapt for your village center district are the type of standards that will produce your plan. Not something else from some other place, but what you all have put many years of investment into figuring out what you want your town center to be. So there's 2 primary elements that the new code will have. A set of illustrations showing use and dimensional regulations for private property and private development. That'll probably include parking standards and the stormwater management stuff that I referenced earlier. And then a new map that'll cover what area of the city that we want to, or the town that we want to include. The good thing is that if we can follow the desire of all of those overlay districts and pull out what they're trying to accomplish and embed those standards inside whatever the village center boundary lines are, we might be able to remove some of the complexity. So somebody trying to build here won't have to say, oh, well, what are the standards for that overlay district on top of this overlay district and the base district? It'll all be in one place, and the map will be a little bit simpler. So those are the 2 basic components, and now I believe we're going to go over some examples of buildings that we might be able to reference to gain insight from.
Yeah, I guess we're going to tag team this, Dan, is that the
Sure.
idea? Yeah.
You might know more about them.
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to include some examples of nearby communities to talk both about what a kind of a village would look like with buildings that more directly related to sidewalks and kind of pedestrian-friendly lifestyle, but also talk a little bit about some of those elements that might inform the code that we're going to write for Littleton. And so we have a range of examples to make a couple of points. The first is Concord. What's important here is the idea that if you're going to have the primary face of the building engage and kind of activate the sidewalk, you want the parking in the back. And so one of the things that we're pretty sure, and this is an example of that we're going to want to do, is probably have even the built form and the parking requirements, maybe even in the same illustration, to make it very clear what the options might be for having a driveway to get to the back, or if there's limitations to the site, how you can have a kind of side-loaded parking lot, but what the requirements might be, but to kind of sort that out for the range of parcels that we know are in the village center. So this is an example of that. Now, if a new building is going to be built in Littleton, it probably isn't going to be built at the scale of some of these historic buildings. They're probably going to be slightly larger buildings than that. We're also going to think about how the form-based code for maybe a larger structure might still require the scale of that architecture to be broken down a little bit. So the buildings have the look and feel of some of the historic buildings. A good example of that is this new structure in West Concord that has kind of retail space on the ground floor and commercial office space on the second floor. This is a potential kind of development model that might happen in Littleton too. For a two-story building, it's more likely the second floor will be office space and not residential. It's very hard to get residential just in one floor to pencil out with retail on the ground floor. But what's nice about this project is it's got the parking in the back, and it's coming at a dimension that is consistent with some of the historic buildings that are there. And so we're going to think about maybe limitations on length of facade as part of the form-based code before maybe developer has to jog the facade back to make sure that we're not getting buildings that are consistent with the kind of existing village character. That's showing you the dimensions of the lot in that drawing, that photograph. This is an example we like quite a bit, which inspired our visualization of a better version of that kind of apples to apples that Dan showed. You know, if there was going to be a development next to the Conant store, should it be a building floating in a parking lot, or should it meet the street? We like the fact that this has a porch-like set of features along the front, which might be a nice model for us to think about as we work on the code a little bit. Maybe there's some places where that kind of covered porch makes sense. That might be a way to unify parts of the town center. Again, the parking tends to be off the street and in the back there too, as a kind of model. That's typically true in a village center. Ones that work well in terms of the pedestrian environment. And then this is an interesting example that we found. This is a larger building. This is the scale that developers tend to like to build these days, not little small buildings, but larger ones. Are there ways that a building of this scale, which works quite well here in terms of the overall kind of character of this streetscape, might still be a good neighbor with some of the historic buildings? Is a porch the answer, or breaking up the facade into sections? That's something else that we're going to look at. Again, the parking is in the back. Or is it okay in some cases, and some lots are narrow on the road but runway deep? Is it okay to have the short end of a building with a facade that kind of respects, you can kind of see it here with the arch there, the historic architecture to allow a building to run back dimensionally? Some of the scenarios that we looked at during the last planning exercise were that. But then what are the rules for parking to also work with a building like that? So we're going to, what we tend to do is write a code, then play with it as architects to try to outsmart ourselves and work back and forth that way. Because in the case of development interests, as architects, we're always looking for loopholes in the code, right? So we look for our own loopholes, but in ways that are flexible enough that development's going to come. We don't want to write a code so tight that the market isn't going to show up. So we're also conscious of building dimensions and some of the logics of kind of development metrics too when we think about this. This is an example of a development that is a rather large building, but those elements of the building that meet the sidewalk are broken down in scale. I don't know if you can see that or not. That's an image of the building under construction, the aerial view. It's got these wings that come out that approximate more the kind of dimension of the historic buildings. And then the kind of larger space is on the back of the lot. We're going to look at this as a potential model too, to allow more development flexibility perhaps. So those are just some of the inspirations outside of Littleton that we've been looking at as we start to think about the kind of draft code that we might start with. And our own process that Dan and Jesse are going to talk about in a little bit more detail, is to try some things internal to the team, play them out, see what the consequences are, to a point that we can come back to you with a draft code. That's the plan, to show you what we think is good about it, where we don't think it's quite worked out yet, to have a conversation with you about where we're headed with this. So, but that's a little bit a kind of window into our thinking process. So Dan's going to talk now about how this might fit back into your existing code.
So the real main thing is that we think we should start from the Village Common Business District, that we think the area that you see in orange. This is already a good starting point because in 2010 everybody decided this is the center of the town. The real thing is that the easiest part of this is probably writing this as a new chapter and deleting references to the Village Common District itself elsewhere in the ordinance so that it's just all in one place. There's another option where we go in and all little, maybe like 75 places across your document, there's references to the VC district. That becomes more complicated, although we'd have to redline them and delete them anyway. But adding text in multiple places in the document causes somebody to have to go through and flip, right? And one of the things I talked about is wanting to just put it all in one place so that it's easy to find, easy to understand. That's one of the goals, is to make it easier to use for everybody. So traditionally, the easiest thing to do is just put it all in one chapter and append it to the end of the document. And that's kind of what this is showing here. And so the goal for all of this, I think you were going to do this slide, but I sort of stole it. But it really, we want to come up with a first version, and like Tim said, we're going to stress test it. We're going to try to actually break what we came up with and see if we can produce results that aren't what you're looking for, and then we'll know that we made a mistake and that we need to make adjustments. We do that repeatedly, over and over again, until we get to something that is routinely producing good results. And a lot of the times we'll be able to provide those examples and show you, like here, we took a site and we modeled 5 or 6 buildings on it using these regulations, and this is what we were able to come up with. Is anything wrong with that? One of the other good things about the examples that we showed is that when you're adjusting dimensional standards, like I said earlier, you can literally drive to these towns and say, we really like this building, we'd love to have one of those in Littleton, and we just measure it. And we understand all of its dimensions, and then we turn that into the new dimensional standards for the new code. I actually did that in Somerville. I spent an entire summer walking around with some interns, surveying hundreds of properties across the city to actually figure out what the dimensional standards should be for their houses. That's something that you want to make sure that if anybody else comes after this project and wants to write you in more form-based districts, make sure they measure the buildings and create calibrated standards for your community. Because your buildings are going to be slightly different than the buildings in Detroit, right? So you don't want somebody to just bring standards from another place and adopt them here. You want to measure examples that you like and then turn those into the standards for new development in your community. So some of the things that we'll look at in adjusting and updating regulation-wise is probably regulating the number of stories of your buildings instead of a total height limit. But we'll regulate individual floor heights, right? And so when you stack those up, they'll produce a building no taller than some amount, right? But one of the problems that we see across all kinds of communities is that when you have a static height limit, developers actually try to maximize the residential ceiling height because you can rent a unit for more money if it's got a 10 or 12 foot ceiling height than an 8 or 9 foot ceiling height. And where they get that height from is by squishing down the commercial first floor, right? And you actually want your first floors to be willing or able to accept a whole range of commercial uses for the whole rest of the life of the building. And if you only have a 7-foot high ceiling, that's going to be an ATM lobby for the whole rest of that building's life, right? And you want to make sure that doesn't happen. So that's why it's more valuable to say a building's allowed to be 3 stories, but we want that first floor to be 14 feet and no more than 20 feet or something of that nature. Again, reducing or adjusting setbacks so that the buildings come in and address the street. There could still be some amount of setback for either a wider sidewalk or outdoor seating, one of the good parts about the sewer project is that you're going to unlock a lot of uses that can't be built right now in the village common because you'll be able to flush toilets, right? So now that you're going to have that ability, we need to write standards that understand those types of uses and what their needs are, not only their ceiling height, but if they want to have outdoor seating, for example, that might be in front of the building. Locating parking to the rear or side of a building. This is typically done through parking setbacks and parking lot design standards. So the same way that you write a setback and said that a building has to be no closer than 10 feet, but no further than 20 feet, for instance. You do the same thing with parking. All parking has to be 20 feet from the front. And if we combine that with the building setbacks, then that means that your building ends up closer to the street and the parking either ends up behind it or beside it. And one of the things that I think is important to point out is we're not trying to get rid of parking requirements. Right? We're not taking that step. So if anybody has that fear that form-based code is trying to also remove parking from our community, that's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about making sure that it's in its place. Ensuring that retail engages the sidewalk, I brought that up with side setbacks. Reducing impervious lot coverage, that might set off some red flags because of your water resource district and the aquifer that you're trying to protect. But that will go in combination with stormwater management requirements, right? So we don't just allow buildings to consume more of the lot and not allow rainwater to get down through the ground without replacing that standard with something else that achieves the result or that achieves the goal with a better result. And then also potentially allowing increased density in the village core itself to amounts that you've already identified in your plan.
Which is Jesse's commentary about the scenario as a kind of starting point, but we'll bring that all back with the draft code too.
Yeah. So that's actually the end. Do you want to talk about
Sure,
next
yeah,
steps?
that's basically the end of the presentation. Before we turn it over to questions, just 2 important dates in the future to look out for. July 25th is that presentation of that draft. Illustrations, versions, tested on particular lots. And then, hopefully, if everything goes well, public hearing for the approval of the code would be in the beginning of September, on September 5th. So please take note, and we'd love to see you guys come back to those. That's it, so we'll do questions.
Perfect. Well, team, thank you very much. It was a great presentation. So thank you. I'm sure we have lots of questions. I'm sure the audience does too. So I'll start with the board first, if anybody wanted to bring anything up.
Change their mind. So thank you again for coming out here and for presenting. I think more than anything else, this is exciting because it allows us to continue the work that has been happening over the last year and a half to try to figure out how we're going to go about revitalizing the common. And this shows us a way that other towns have been able to incorporate this. So I think it's been very helpful from that standpoint. So would you say that based off of what you have observed with Littleton through the past work that you've done and also in the master plan, that you have sufficient information to go off of, or are you still going to be seeking additional information from folks about what we'd like to see?
Maybe I'll stand up. I think our hunch is that the first goal in terms of our decision-making about trying different code models and playing with them is the relationship of the building to the sidewalk and the relationship with the parking ratios are required to that building is where we're going to start. And so I think a lot of the thinking through this might be driven by the kind of pragmatism of just kind of thinking through on as many parcels as possible how that actually plays out so that we can hit parking. That was a little bit the issue with the scenarios in the last process too, the kind of development scenarios that we did. So I think our hunch is that the buildings want to be, maybe an additional 10 feet back from the back of the sidewalk, maybe more or less. We haven't quite determined that. And then we're gonna play with kind of market reasonable footprints of those buildings and kind of work it out. It's gonna be an iterative process for us a little bit to figure that out, but I don't think there's anything that we need to know that we don't know to get it going. I think at the next meeting, we're gonna have a ton of questions for you. There's probably gonna be sub-options and observations that we have after we get into the, it's, in a way, this is enjoyable because we're writing a game that we play. You know what I mean? With an outcome that we think is clear enough that we can get started.
Right. So at the next session, then folks will be able to
Yeah.
observe and ask more questions as
Yeah,
well.
exactly, because we'll say, here's our hunch about what the code should be. Here it is, here's 3 ways a developer might respond to it, and here's how it reflects, some of the planning that's already been done, and outcomes through actual photographs in other communities. So I think that's probably the kind of evidence that we'll have next time. Don't you think, Dan and Jesse? Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. But that makes sense.
I have a question. So if the goal is to create a kind of New England common area, and you're looking at other towns in the area, how do you ensure that Littleton will at least be unique from West Acton, Concord, and it doesn't just become another cookie cutter village center?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think the difference is that because of the historic settlement patterns in Littleton, these are still going to be a series of freestanding buildings with space between them, which is very different than Concord Center, where you get 0 lot line buildings. So I think we're going to look very closely at the existing historic patterns to write the code. So we're going to be looking at Littleton itself, particularly as you get closer to the common, where there's more historic buildings for some of the clues. So we're going to make it as customized as possible. But it's a good question because there are some aspects of historic village centers that are common. The village centers tend to be common based on how relatively rural they were through their historic development, up and through the Second World War. And so there are other communities that have similar town centers to Littleton too, just because of whether they were on the post road or not, and what the kind of the trades were in the town, or how soon they became a kind of bedroom community for jobs elsewhere. That tends to impact the kind of look and feel of the different villages. But I think Dan also spoke to our kind of commitment to make it very Littleton-y, right? I don't know if I have anything else about it, Dan.
Well, I know of some codes, I know of one in Florida that their main street, they decided they wanted every building to have a balcony at the second floor. And so they were able to codify that. They just said every building has to have a balcony, and everybody was able to, all the architects at every individual building figured out how to achieve that differently. So they all looked different, but then their main street had this overhang.
Theme.
Yeah, a theme that ran down the street after, it slowly redeveloped over time. And some people made a metal balcony, some people built it out of wood, some people made it a gallery where, like in New Orleans, have you ever seen New Orleans buildings that come all the way out to the sidewalk? So, you still achieve architectural uniqueness from building to building, but it starts knitting together because every building has some common features. It may be that there's a cornice line at the second floor, even if that cornice is allowed to be very modern in how it's designed. You could.
We like the porch idea, the Conant store. Like, what if that, was required to become a kind of theme of Littleton, which, they're here and there in different village centers, but over time, over the 30 years that Jesse proposed, as things get redeveloped, that becomes a kind of the village of porches or something that have the kind of walkway to get to all the stores and things. So we're going to think of some elements that we pull out of what we see that we'll kind of use the next meeting as a focus group to talk about.
So that's something then we as a community should be thinking about.
Yeah.
Just what could we do that's a little bit different so we're not just another cookie cutter?
I think so. But I think that what's nice about the second floor balcony or the idea of the porch it's not just visual features, they have a kind of social component to them. Like the idea of a second floor porch is that if it's required, a building owner or developer is gonna think, you know, they also add to the kind of social ambiance too. So we like best features that have a social component, not just a visual component.
They help build community.
Yeah.
That's, you know, houses with front porches tend to cause neighbors to engage with one another. And if you want porches, you can create incentives in zoning. For instance, a lot of codes, for instance, yours only has a front setback, right? Everything has to be behind that line. A lot of form-based codes that try to encourage porches on houses say the building has to be behind that line, but the porch can project forward into that setback. And that actually means that you're not, when you build a porch, it's not taking away from the volume of the building that you're allowed to build. So actually, people are become very supportive of building that porch because it doesn't make the house smaller. So little tweaks like that can start producing the results that you're looking for.
But I'm also thinking as fast as I'm thinking, well, that's like, what other interesting things could we propose? Every building has to have a weather vane. It'll be the weather prediction, like, I don't know, I like, it's kind of, there's a creative aspect to this too, I think. You know, all kidding aside, so we're gonna think and propose some ideas when we come with the model. I think the setback and parking issue is kind of a fundamental thing that will kind of sort itself out, as I said before, kind of through the pragmatics of problem solving. But this other question that you have, I think we'll probably have some options or some proposals for you.
Well, and over again, especially in the master plan, throughout that process and the charrettes that were done, people did speak over and over again about the walkability.
Yeah.
And so I think that needs to be an integral part to whatever the design is, yeah.
I think we'll justify almost everything that you see next time on that central goal,
Yeah,
you know,
great.
walkability.
I personally found a lot of value in the reading the plan documents. I think they did a really good job at identifying not only what the problems are, but the versions of the future that you're looking to create. And so you just need better requirements to produce that future.
Have you guys done any optimization modeling on this? Like what the density should be for the properties now? Should you allow no parking at all? Allowing zero offsets, frontage, backage? Because the way that the property moves down the road, you don't have the kind of space you need to do some of the things you guys are talking about. Maybe it'd be better to have different offset requirements at different locations.
Yeah, we're gonna look into that. Our scenario planning with the last plan, that kind of sample area that we looked at as the district kind of bow ties down to a very narrow thing, maybe you can go back to that, allowed us to take a lot of different parcel sizes and densities out for a test drive. So I think that gives us a pretty good handle, because you get much bigger parcels as you get further away from the common,
Right.
and they get small and tight when they get closer. I think that we have some embedded knowledge about that just because of those 5 scenarios we ran during the last process.
But then further, what's the maximum occupancy, and then maybe what the maximum intensity use could look like if that was a fully built-out space using the new bylaws? Like, what kind of flow would that generate for sewer? What kind of municipal costs would that incur to the town? Like, what is a couple of scenarios that you could see it playing out down the road, and how long would that take?
Yeah, we'll push the code. We'll write the code and then push the code for somebody that wants to develop the biggest building possible and see what the consequences are. One choice might be, we've got to tweak the code because we don't want buildings that big. But we did some economic analysis around the scenario planning during the last plan, but for the most part, we're leveraging off that plan to write the code now. We're not taking a half a step further back to rethink some of those assumptions that came out of that last process, if that makes sense.
I don't know what that means.
Or you can adjust, so for instance, you can come up with the same size and shape building, but allow different densities in it, and it'll have an effect on the water, right? If it's 10 units versus 100 units, there'd be a whole different water output from that building. And we would know that just by adjusting the number, then it changes the dwelling units and then changes the gallons per dwelling unit that's produced. So the scenarios can actually, like even if we get all the form-based aspects right, what happens inside of that has an impact on the things that you're talking about, taxes and water flow and all that
Well,
stuff.
it'd be nice to know what's the upper limit.
Right,
So if
right.
you say, hey, what's the impact of the tax base? Well, at worst case scenario, if it was heavily residential, it had X flow, you might have this many families,
What's the impact, yeah?
the impact of taxes could be this.
Right, right.
Most likely outcome is gonna be this.
I think the easiest thing is actually going to be able to predict, to try and estimate the gallons of water that's going to be produced.
Sure.
The harder thing is trying to predict the family that might live in each unit. So there'll be assumptions built into that, but as long as we're all on the same page, understanding what the assumptions are and
Well,
agreeing
one
with
of the
them.
problems we ran into, especially with the point, right, we allotted for parking, right? But on Saturday morning, there's not a parking space to be found, that's Market Basket.
Yeah.
We probably should have more parking, but we didn't know.
Yeah.
One of the things that you probably have is rules that are not allowing people to share parking and allowing people to cross from parking lot to parking lot. Sometimes the banks like to prevent people from crossing from parking lot to parking lot, but we can write, the things that banks won't overrule is local zoning. So if the zoning says that there has to be a connection from one parking lot to another, they'll want to protect their investment, their financial investment in a property by making sure that the property's compliant with zoning, and if the zoning says we have to allow cross-use.
But there's other things we could do for parking, like Maynard put in a municipal parking lot behind all their buildings downtown, so they solved that problem. 20 years ago, they didn't have that, so you couldn't go to the clothing store and then go have dinner, like you had to move.
It's true in Concord too, behind those buildings I
Same
showed,
thing.
that's a collective parking lot.
So like, where would be the likely areas to have that for downtown? How would you go about doing that?
Yeah. I mean, it's not in the scope of what we've been asked to do.
But that's,
Municipal
if
parking?
you're gonna make that work down there, we have to think that through. If it's successful, you're gonna have a parking problem.
That would require,
I think I
Yeah.
mean, say, if we step back to the study that we did here, there were a couple solutions that were
Yeah.
offered
Yeah.
yeah,
in
I
that
think
process.
we're, I think Dan's, like, the code, the land use code affects the rights of private property owners, now and in the future,
Right.
right? And so, it's hard to build into the code, a kind of taking of private land for municipal parking lot, but we can write it into the code, a requirement for shared parking and interconnections between parking lots to require private property owners. That's a kind of interim fix. The decision about a municipal parking lot and where it should be, and the process that the town would take to, if it's already town-owned or would acquire it, is a very different kind of process.
I think it's a negotiation between the town and the property owner. I don't
That's right.
think it's a taking. I think you say, if it makes economic sense for all parties, then you go ahead and do it.
That's right.
Yeah.
And there might be a win-win with three property owners to say, we're willing to take on the operation and maintenance of this parking lot, get it off your tax roll, but your customers will be allowed to park here, and so it's a win-win. That's often how those negotiations happen.
One of the things you'll be able to figure out is if the zoning allows this amount of development, that it'll put you into the range of, we might need a municipal parking lot. That you'll be able to determine that bit by knowing the build out.
Right,
Yeah.
you can see it coming, so you can adjust.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Well, I think if I may add, one of the aspects of some of the ideas that I've heard you guys talk about before is if you have a parking lot, that can actually be perhaps a green space on top of the parking lot, or there can be other ways to be able to really incorporate all of the water, the drainage aspects
If we could
of
go
it.
back to the scenarios from the last process, we were, which is a long way back, we were very careful
Right.
to never show a scenario where you couldn't get the parking for what we were showing on the parcel we were looking at. So I'll show you in a minute, as soon as Dan finds it. What happens, they get a block.
Here we go.
Here we go. So in this case, we're gonna write a code for lower building heights than this, but this was one of the scenarios we looked at, and we very carefully stayed within the parcel lines, got the parking either in the side or the back, and made sure that the parking ratios for the picture we were showing could be solved on the sites we were showing. And so generally, we're not going to, and this was on the slightly higher end of the kind of density that people were willing to support. So I would say that, except maybe on some of the very biggest parcels, which might be something else we do in the code, which is require a different process if a parcel is bigger than X, for the densities that are being proposed, you can get the parking to work on site and still get that walkable edge that we're talking about. We never get to a point here where it would trigger the need for a municipal parking lot.
If I may, we have another question in the audience.
Yeah.
Just want to add in that through the master plan process and other discussions since then, I think it's been recognized that if we're successful with this, we have to have a parallel conversation about some infrastructure needs, it's specifically parking, and just the way the things spread out here, I don't think there's any one perfect idea, but it may lend itself to having multiple smaller lots, like something behind the mill, something on the other side of the common, and then when you go up Great Road, the back of the properties heading toward Acton, they have a lot of open space there.
Parking fit, yeah.
And even when we were looking at the DCU building, just to throw out one specific thing, the back lot there, I mean, some of those properties could have, a below grade, an at grade, and above grade thing, and not be too overwhelming. But again, that does, it absolutely requires the town to get out there and either buy them or get involved with the state in a partnership, something like that.
Yeah, because you're gonna wanna know the answer to these questions before you go to the floor.
Yeah, and I agree, and if the form-based code changes don't address parking, if that's the intent, then we have to do it on a parallel process.
Yeah, well, a couple of things about park, we're dealing with parking issues with a couple of other assignments that we have, is that the economics require, even for shared parking, that they be surface lots and not structured parking. You can't get support from the state anymore for a public parking garage, because construction costs have gone like this and parking revenue has gone like this. So you can't justify through revenue a bond for a public, I think Northampton is the last municipality in the Commonwealth that got a parking garage. And
I believe that we're also gonna see a decrease in vehicle use in the future as well. So I think as the population might grow, we might stay level with the parking needs
Yeah.
over time. So I don't think we're gonna see the need for the parking that we're talking about, because you're gonna see more ride sharing going on, or, if we create walkability with residential, you're gonna have components where people can live and walk in the same area as well. So I get the question on the parking needs in the study, but I think that through form-based, we can get there.
Yeah, I like Dan's idea that we might require interconnectivity between parking lots at the back. I never heard of that one, that's a good one. Because that allows for more flexibility relative to overflow. I mean, you get into some legal issues about liability of parking on other people's property and things, but we've dealt with that legally in some cities where.
That's how you're able to navigate Maynard, West Concord, even downtown Concord has access through back. So when you get
Kinda sneak
boxed out,
around.
otherwise what happens is you try to park and you try to go to dinner and you're dropping people off, and then the guy's got to park and you see him 20 minutes later. Like, that's a detriment to using those places.
Yeah.
But they solve some of that. Yeah.
And I think because you get very shallow parcels as you're closer to the common, and they get wider and wider as you move away, that interconnectivity will be especially important in those deeper parcels on Great Road, to allow for cars to navigate a kind of almost like a back alley system. And so we'll think about that pretty carefully. I think it's a good point. I mean, I think you are a little bit land starved about where you put those parking lots, though,
Right.
because right at the common are the historic smallest parcels.
Could you go back to the slide where you were showing the actual photographs of the different downtown areas?
Yeah.
And you had the one where, under construction.
No.
And I know that building because I worked on that building, I actually helped build it. But what you can't see in that photograph is that's also under building parking in the whole back area of that.
There's a grade drop off, is that how it works?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge drop. So when we were building that, and I know it well because I spent a lot of cold winter nights under there thawing out plumbing.
Oh,
Yes.
under the deck, yeah.
Yes, so
Right, but that was I mean, I grew up there, that was a loading area, and we used to play in there when we were kids, and it's always been like that.
Right. It was-
So, I mean, that's the other thing, like, the topography, is there opportunity in Littleton to
Yeah.
create parking?
Where it drops back off
So
the
from the
road.
front, this is a two-story building, but from the rear, that's a four-story building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's an asset
And
when you
that's
have
all
that.
parking from here back,
yeah,
underneath that structure.
yeah.
One of
So-
the things that's always amazed me about Littleton is that you might have a home that looks like it's a small home, but then you look on the backside and it just keeps going
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
back.
Yeah.
So being able to do those kinds of architectural designs would be really.
Has anyone seen, or have you heard of the book, Big House, Little House, Back House, Barn? Yeah, that's a really good book for that, and talking about exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the other examples we had here in this deck, if you go backward or forwards, maybe backwards, that's an example of that one, where it runs far back, and you still have the right kind of scale,
So
meaning the
if I
sidewalk.
may, I'm also a building inspector for the town of Concord. There's more fights in that parking lot than anywhere else in the whole town, by the way that building is set up in the angled parking.
Yeah,
The police are down there all the time.
What are the fights about?
angle parking?
It's usually somebody hitting somebody else and getting angry, because they're just constantly bumping into each other in that
Yeah.
building.
People have less road rage in Littleton, maybe.
Less expensive cars, maybe, I don't know.
Other
I think he had a
questions?
hand.
No.
No? Good?
One thing that I haven't heard mentioned yet is how we deal with historic resources, if there's a historic building to be redeveloped rather than removed and replaced.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We should address that. I think that's a good point. I mean, you have, the historic assets add to the character quite a bit. And whether they're listed or not, you want to preserve as many of them as possible and encourage them to be preserved, because some of the, some buildings from the 20s and 30s, add character, but they also might eventually be vulnerable. So we're gonna have to think pretty carefully about that.
Could you go back to that slide, the garage, that one? Yeah, so, right here is a historic structure. They used to live right here.
And they moved it,
And they
okay.
picked it up and relocated it. This building here is also an historic structure, and this wing here actually used to sit behind the house. And if you could see right here, there's a red barn. I picked up that red barn with a crane, moved it back here, rebuilt this whole structure. It's very modern on the backside, saved everything historic on the front, and then we just added a wing between these two, and we picked that up and moved it. And actually saved the original chimney in the
Yeah, yeah.
structure and moved it. So,
You can start
The one
retraining
issue
historic
I want-
structures as a commodity or something.
So one
yeah.
of the issues we had, though, was dealing with the historic commission in that town. The delays to get the permits through to build this were 4 years.
Wow.
It's a ridiculous amount of time.
But they were
get a
opposed to the
building.
relocation.
They were opposed to the whole thing. It's the most successful building in West Acton right now. But they were opposed to the whole idea. So there has to be some level of common sense as well in understanding economic development on all the boards where everybody's gonna be making decisions. So
But
the
it-
whole
but
reason I
it-
brought it back was I wanna make sure that if we're gonna be looking at historic value and preservation,
That it's seen flexibly.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
But that's, but a lot of the, moving those buildings around is different than tearing them down. So there's a common sense assessment. That'll add value to our development, because it's the kind of look we're after. And so we should think about that pretty carefully,
But
because.
you're not talking about superseding another board. I mean, if we have a historical commission, do we have one? That you need to get a
We do.
permit?
We certainly have a historical commission. We do not have a historic district. One was proposed for that area, but was defeated, something like 95 or something. But we certainly have some historic buildings there, which we and the commission would like to see preserved.
But are they a controlling authority? In other words, we
No.
have to go and get them, all right, so we don't have that problem.
We have,
But we would
the
listen.
procedure we have now is demolition delays. You can't tear anything down.
How long is it?
A year.
A year? Okay.
So I'm all
So it
for
makes a lot-
preservation as opposed to replication, but restoration is an important part of preservation. And in doing that, I mean, we achieved some really significant
Yeah.
architectural details that needed to be saved, but the battle was unbelievable. And here in town, where they don't have they're not a controlling authority, certainly want their input. Right now, I'm working on 12 Robinson Road, which is our, Paul, if you could help me, what year, 16?
1673, but,
Yeah, questionable.
There's some questions about it.
Up for debate, but
Anywhere from
there's a beam in there,
1680
there's a beam in there that is carved 1673.
Oh, really?
It's an old
Wow.
structure. And the town just recently bought it, a year and a half ago, I think. A year ago to save it from demolition. So it's, if it ever gets moved, it'll be deed restricted if it stays in town control.
Right.
But we'd love to see that incorporated in all this. It's part of the common anyway.
Oh, it is, okay.
But would you have to, do you have to write something in the bylaw? Like, let's say you are gonna preserve, so you're gonna move a structure, and it doesn't conform. Does the bylaw kick in at that point, or do you need to write an exception for that? Like, hey, we're gonna move this to another lot, it's not gonna conform, but it doesn't have to because it's a preservation.
There's a couple of ways we could address it. I'm gonna wing ding this, is that okay, Dan?
Sure.
You could, you could allow any structure with most of its historic exterior features intact, built before 1924, could be moved to other places in the district and be non-conforming.
That's what I'm saying.
With consultation with
Historic
Mike,
Commission.
and can be added onto, on the rear and sides where the original presentation of the structure is maintained or something.
Yeah, with their input.
Yeah, with their input. I think to build that right into it, to motivate maybe private interest to kind of do the right thing, because I think we're more interested in the overall village character and less about the preservation of this thing like a museum here, and so the more of that can be recycled, if it makes sense, the better, I think. That's my own, I'm.
Well, it
I
makes
always-
it easier to make a decision on, and you don't have to deliberate it for 5 meetings and.
Yeah, it's
call
right in the
outside
code,
counsel
and it's
and
part of the
stuff.
spirit,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I think from the point of view of the historical commission, at least from my point of view, there's some buildings like that building that the town just bought, which are very valuable and probably should be maintained pretty much as they are, where they are. Lots of other historic buildings in the community which we want to see preserved, but where a lot of these other things that you've talked about would certainly work very well. I don't know whether moving, but building onto them and, using them in various ways, I think could work very well, and I think
We can
we would
address.
encourage
I
that.
just think you wanna have options.
Yeah, I think we should just address that whole question specifically in the code, I think.
There's another reason I bring it up too, is there's other homes in town that are being donated by developers that have some historical significance, but may not be useful where they sit currently. We actually have a building that's in storage right now that was saved, that we'd love to see be
Would it work in
reincorporated.
Southie where I live? I can put it in my backyard?
Or in the common area, with
Yeah.
the long store, and we'd love to see it,
Oh,
salvaged
interesting.
as well.
It's an interesting thing.
This sounds like it might be something that could be useful for like an incentive program that encourages the reuse of historic assets. The easiest one I can think of is a density bonus. Like you get a little bit more residential development if you incorporate the building and keep it, or even if it's relocated, but the fact that it's there and part of the project, then you get a little bit more housing. That also helps cover the costs of it keeping it
Right.
instead of demolishing it, but.
Yeah,
With
that's
the-
the kind of thing we would like to see.
Yeah, and that's something that we have to figure out from an economic perspective, because every additional unit has a value, and so it's not just give some more density, it's you want to calibrate those specifically, but it sounds like a good candidate for that type of thing. That's something where, like, I would go look at probably hundreds of codes and try to find how are they dealing with historic resources from all over the place? What other tools are there, that people have come up with? That's not a form-based necessarily specific thing, but more of a policy that you're looking for. But luckily, I have a library of
I know,
hundreds of codes.
Dan's a hobbyist. He, even beyond the scope, he does interesting research, so that's good. Okay, I think that whole historic structure piece is quite insightful, yeah. Other questions?
You didn't mention signage. Do you work on that? I know Littleton has a bylaw for signs.
Yeah, it's not in our scope, in terms of what we're gonna be doing with the code. We're really focused on the zoning code in terms of what we're gonna do. But I think a parallel process that looks at that makes sense. I think it's clear that there's some signs that are grandfathered when you come into the village center.
Does everyone feel that there's a
How does that
process?
sound?
And you're right.
That's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, I don't-
So we have a sign bylaw in town. There's some issues legally with how it's enforced.
Yeah.
After the Supreme Court came out with, you know, your freedom of speech and how you can affect a sign. That being said, I know that a lot of people in town have talked about the lack of enforcement or the lack of the sign bylaw being effective. I think if we actually took a look at our sign bylaw, which I have, it's a good bylaw.
Yeah.
It definitely needs some tweaks for the times we're in, but.
We've done a couple of sign guidelines and bylaws, but the most satisfying one is that we redid the sign requirements for downtown crossing and the surrounding commercial area in downtown Boston. And we, like the codes that Dan's talking about, we did them as a form-based drawn code rather than a series of prescriptions. And for reasons that were a little bit random at the time, we drew in 3 dimensions the code and had the dimensions right on there, just like the illustrations that Dan showed. But we made all of the signs a kind of red, just to make it clear that was the sign. And the code was so successful that people were putting in more red signs than they had intended. Like it's weird how an illustration, like pre-rationally, like gets people, like, I don't think even people thought consciously of it, but all the way up Brownfield Street, all the new signs were red. It was like, so I guess it was effective.
Like if every building diagram has a barn roof, you might all of a sudden get every proposal having a barn roof.
Oh, they
even
want
though
barn
it's just
roofs.
an
Yeah.
illustration.
So we have to be a little bit careful about that. But if you take your sign code and you illustrate it, maybe as a piece of, write a grant, Mark,
She writes a lot of
it might be more effective.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's something that we could tackle, you
Yeah.
know, bilaterally with you guys while you're working through the form base. When you're speaking of Florida area ratio, I can speak to that firsthand, being an inspector first in Newton and now in Concord.
Oh.
Where both the city and the town have them, and it destroys architecture. That's the first thing it does, is destroy architecture. And then you compile that along with a height restriction. And you've gone from these beautiful 12 and 14 pitch colonial houses to 8 pitch, 6 pitch, flat, almost flat roofs on colonials
Yeah,
because
that's
they're trying to
work.
maximize
Yeah.
the floor area without exceeding the roof height. So it's definitely a detrimental thing. So I'm glad we don't have it here in Littleton, and I would oppose it as long as I sit in this seat.
Yeah.
So.
It also, given their complexity, it makes space for land use attorneys.
Right.
You know, that complicated disconnect between the floor area ratio and the physical outcome, you know, because you never know what you're gonna get. You know, and architects and developers look for the way to game that system to get as much density as possible. And so you have the shallow pitches, weird shapes on sites, and they seek a fully compliant project, and then there's very little that can be done to oppose it.
Modified, yeah.
Yeah.
There was another hand
I
up.
mean, Mr. Zeldin had his hand up at one time.
Well, I'm more interested, or I'm interested in how much impact can the private property owner, whether they're residents of Littleton or not, what's the best vehicle for them, as it were, to enjoy and benefit from the process that you're undertaking?
What I've found is like them being involved in what, like, to understand what their desires are for the long run in owning and operating their property is a really beneficial input into, you know, balancing what we're trying to have built here, or what you're all trying to have built in your village common, but understand their needs and interests as a business operator or property owner. So being involved in the process is probably number one. Coming to all the meetings and engaging is part of that, and that's how I think is best for them to be involved. If you write a code that is totally against their interests, not only will they fight it tooth and nail as you go throughout the process of just trying to get it adopted, but it won't actually help, them to fully invest in their property. If they then end up with zoning that doesn't help their business thrive, for instance, they'll start retracting from caring about that property and what everybody else's desires are for the commons. So you want something that helps marry everybody's individual interests into a better version
But I
of your
think
own self.
But I think, if you continue to run your business from your existing structure and your offspring are gonna take it over, you just keep on living your life in the building that you're in.
Oh, yeah.
It's only at the point of redevelopment or a transaction where the new regulations kick in. And so I found that the interest it has to do with any impacts on the value of my land or not. It has less to do with the kind of actual operational kind of implications of the code. So in all cases, we're looking in terms of density there's a little bit of upzoning here. So in the abstract, if a property owner is going to get some advice from their attorney, should I be for this or against this? It's like, you should be for it because you can keep operating, but if you ever sell, there's more density possible, more value than the existing zoning. And, because there's a shared vision and there's some like placemaking going on here that might affect values positively too. So we do have an eye on how the market might respond to, we talked about it a little bit in the last process, but I think it's a good question. But this only really affects, the next stage of development on a parcel. It doesn't really affect today and now. And I suspect in a lot of communities, change happens at different rates based on who those people are. Are they legacy businesses? Are they, do you have a whole set of owners that are, ready to cash out and retire to St. Pete Beach? It all depends. Like, everybody on my street in South Boston all retired at the same time and all got on JetBlue and went to Fort Myers. Like, why did that happen? So I don't, because the property values went up. So I don't, how zoning actually affects the rate of change. It involves so many factors.
That's true.
The only reason I mention it in this context is that the town is moving, hopefully, to put a modern sewing system in the common. And commercial property owners are required to hook up, whether they're that is, they're required to join in, whether or not they actually turn on the switch. So there, all the fees associated with it. So there is already depending on your point of view, large or small. Yeah, there's an incentive to say, oh, and so far it looks as if many of them, especially the ones that have the space in which to operate, have already decided, oh, this looks interesting. And of course, silence falls because now they're working with whoever they're planning it with. So it's my interest was just to ask the question so that the notion of being able to be in touch with those or to invite them, even if you don't really like what they're going to say to you, is going to be very helpful. I think in addition to, of course, the input of the residents.
So we have a virtual question that just came in. Can we put saloon doors as a requirement?
I like that. That'd be very distinctive, yeah. Little touches like that.
That being said, if there's no more questions, I'd like to actually open it up to be more of a social atmosphere and people could mingle and come up and ask you questions if they don't want to ask them publicly. So I'd like to take this moment to thank you guys for your participation and your help and your information. You guys have been great, so thank you.
Yeah, we're excited about this. So.
Thank you.
Yeah. We're excited. Oh, the camera's still on. Wow. We're still on. Very good, you guys.